When the HOA decided to divert sewage water straight into my chicken coop, destroying everything and putting my animals in danger, I knew I couldn't let it go. You know that feeling of opening your front door and being greeted by a smell that could be classified as a chemical weapon? That's what hit me that fateful morning. A mixture of rot, sewage, and absolute injustice. The kind of thing that sticks to your nose and soul. I ran out to the chicken coop, feeling my stomach churn before I even got there. And when I finally saw the damage, I realized that hell didn't need to be made of fire. All it needed was a good sewage system. The fence, which I had built myself with my calloused hands, was partially submerged. The ground, which had once been dirt and dry hay, was now a stinking swamp of human waste. My poor chickens huddled in a corner as if they had just witnessed a massacre. Some tried to balance on branches and crates to escape the contaminated water, while others looked at me as if to say, "Man, is this serious?" And it was. Looking around, I saw the source of the disaster. A new pipe, shiny and, of course, strategically positioned right on the border of my property. And I knew exactly who was behind it. The HOA, the damned neighborhood association that seemed to have been founded solely to make my life hell. They always had a way of making trouble for me. But that was a declaration of war. To recap, my relationship with the HOA had been on the rocks for a long time. Ever since I moved to this estate, the woman who led this cult of absurd rules decided that I was an affront to the aesthetic standard of the community, and it's been hell ever since. First, they took issue with the height of my fence. Then, with the sound of my rooster crowing in the morning. Because, of course, how dare I have an animal that makes noise on a farm? But now they had crossed the line in a way that not even a priest could forgive. I knew that complaining would do no good. If I called, I'd be fobbed off with bureaucratic excuses. If I went to the office, they'd probably give me that debauched smile and push some absurd fine on me for existing in the same space as them. So instead of wasting time with bureaucracy, I did what any sensible person would do. I sat on my porch, grabbed a beer, and stared at the soggy chicken coop, taking a deep breath and planning my revenge. Had they given me dirt? I'd give them something much, much worse. But first, I needed information. I found out exactly how this little environmental disaster had happened. And, as I suspected, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accidental leak or a pipe problem. It was a planned project, signed off on and approved by the HOA, diverting part of the drainage from the neighborhood directly onto my land. The justification? Redirecting the flow to optimize drainage. In other words, screw the farmer. Let's turn his yard into a shit tank. If that's how they wanted to play it, then that's how the game was going to start. The plan that hatched in my head was simple, dirty, and completely brilliant. Did they flood me with sewage? I was going to make sure they felt what it was like to have their precious property invaded by something that didn't belong there. And believe me, I wasn't talking about more sewage. I had something much more solid in mind. Revenge is a dish best eaten cold, but in this case, it would be served hard and impossible to remove without a jackhammer. I spent days planning every detail. I didn't want something that would simply annoy the HOA, like planting a bunch of weeds in front of their headquarters or letting a bunch of pigs loose in the parking lot. No, that was too childish. I wanted something that would cause real damage, a problem that would make every one of them lose nights of sleep and tear their hair out trying to solve it. And that's how I came up with my plan. Concrete. Nothing symbolizes the permanence and weight of a mistake like a ton of hardened cement. First, I did my research. I discovered that the HOA, in its infinite arrogance, had an administrative office in a small building, one of those they built on the community land, thinking that nobody would mind. It was a relatively new space, with a nice reception desk, a meeting room, and, most importantly, the archive where they kept all the association's documents. It was then that I realized the heart of the beast was there. With no time to lose, I needed the right materials. Fortunately, living on a farm has its advantages. No one suspects a guy buying concrete in bulk. I mean, it makes sense. Anyone who owns land needs cement to reinforce buildings, repair fences, make a base for heavy equipment. So, when I ordered a generous load of ready-mixed concrete, no one blinked an eye. The plan was simple: clog up that damned office with fresh concrete and make sure that when it hardened, there would be nothing left but a stone monument to the HOA's stupidity. But how to do that without getting caught? This is where the real masterpiece comes in. In the dead of night, wearing an old cap and clothes I'd normally wear when dealing with cattle, because nothing attracts less attention than a guy dirty with dirt and grease, I went to the office. My farm was relatively close to the HOA headquarters, so I could move around without arousing suspicion. Once there, I prepared everything carefully. I already knew that there was an air drain next to the building's foundation, and since these snobs loved smooth concrete and spotless floors, they had several air vents connected to an internal ventilation system. And that's where I started. Calmly and precisely, I fitted the hoses from the concrete mixer truck I had hired anonymously and positioned everything strategically. As soon as the concrete started pouring, it would run through the ducts and start filling the office from the inside out. Now, if you're thinking, but what about the alarms? What about the security cameras? Well, let's just say I've done my homework. The HOA, with all its money from absurd fees and ridiculous fines, was extremely incompetent when it came to security. I found out that they never even activated the cameras on the back side of the building. They were just decorations to scare the curious. And the alarm system? Installed, but never properly configured. The only real security there was the locked doors and sealed windows, which was perfect because the concrete didn't need an official entrance to break in. When the truck started pouring the concrete into the ventilation ducts, I felt such satisfaction that I almost cried with joy. The mixture flowed into the building like a river of liquid revenge, filling every corner, every corridor, every cupboard full of idiotic regulations and complaints forms. Every second, I imagined the faces of those bureaucrats as they arrived for work the next day, opened the door, and were faced with a solid block of concrete where the receptionist's desk used to be. The best part? They would never have been able to remove it without a massive construction project. The concrete wasn't just an aesthetic problem. It would harden in the registers, the sockets, the archives. If they were lucky, they would be able to save half a dozen papers before realizing that everything was lost. And that was that. When the last drop of concrete was poured, I turned everything off, collected my things, and returned home, taking care to look as innocent as a farmer can be. The next day, I woke up early, had my coffee, and waited. I waited for the glorious moment when chaos would ensue. And, my friend, it was worth it. You know that indescribable pleasure of seeing the exact moment when someone realizes they've screwed up? That look of panic, mixed with denial and despair? I lived that moment, and it was better than any revenge movie I've ever seen. The next morning, I walked out onto my balcony, coffee in hand, enjoying the sunrise as if it were a normal day. But it wasn't. This was the day my little work of art would be unveiled to the world. It didn't take long for the screams to start. The first to arrive was the HOA secretary, that woman with the voice of a hysterical cicada and the annoying habit of chewing gum, as if she were trying to crush glass. As soon as she opened the door to the headquarters, she let out a scream so high-pitched it could break glasses. And frankly, I was expecting a reaction like that. But nothing could have prepared me for the real spectacle that followed. One by one, the HOA suits arrived. The vice president, the treasurer, the board members, that bunch of parasites who lived off collecting fees and fining any poor person who dared to have a personality. The woman in charge, that dictator in the form of a frustrated housewife, arrived with her fancy coffee in hand, ready for another day of making other people's lives hell. But when she saw the scene, she dropped her cup on the floor. From a distance, I could see her face going through all the stages of grief at once: denial, anger, more anger, pure hatred, and, finally, despair. The whole building was ruined. The windows looked intact from the outside, but inside they were just decorative frames for a solid block of concrete. The doors wouldn't open because, surprise, there were tons of cement blocking everything inside. The furniture? Sunk forever in a sea of stone. The files and documents? Buried like fossils from a time when the HOA still ruled the neighborhood. It was a total disaster. I wish I was closer to hear the conversation that followed, but from their gestures and visible outbursts, I could get a good idea. First, they tried to force the door, which was hilarious, because it wouldn't move even if they called a crane. Then, the treasurer, one of those guys who thinks he knows everything, started giving random orders while typing frantically on his cell phone, probably calling someone to sort it out quickly. And then came the glorious moment. She picked up the phone, called someone, and started shouting. I already knew who the call was for: the police. Now, I knew that technically what I'd done wasn't exactly legal, but I also knew that proving it was me wouldn't be easy. Firstly, because the HOA had no idea who their real enemy was, and second, because if they tried to charge me, they would have to admit that they had diverted sewage onto my property, which would be a much bigger problem for them. So I sat back, watched, and enjoyed the show. The first police arrived in less than an hour. 2 cars, sirens off, because, after all, it wasn't a violent crime, just a major vandalism incident, as one of the more gossipy neighbors later described it. The funniest part was when the older policeman tried to open the door as if, by some miracle, it would give way. When he realized it was useless, he banged on the concrete wall a few times and let out a tired sigh. I could almost hear him thinking, for God's sake, why did they call me in for this? The HOA insisted on filing a police report, but you could see that the officers were holding back their laughter. The investigation began, but let's be honest, no one at the police station was going to lose nights of sleep trying to find out who poured concrete in the HOA's office. That was, at best, an instant urban legend. Meanwhile, the chaos was spreading. The treasurer shouted that they had to find a way to remove the concrete, and then came the final blow: the budget. To remove that amount of concrete, they would need to bring in heavy equipment, hire specialized professionals, and perhaps even demolish part of the structure. In short, the HOA would have to spend a small fortune to reverse the damage, and that's when the icing on the cake came. Their insurance didn't cover this kind of damage. Apparently, in an attempt to save money, the HOA chose a very cheap insurance policy that didn't cover large-scale internal vandalism. This meant that if they wanted to restore the building, they would have to pay out of pocket. And now, you see, I knew exactly how the HOA worked. I knew exactly how their money was managed. And I also knew that, in practice, the only way to cover such a high cost would be to raise fees for all residents. In other words, not only did my revenge destroy their headquarters, but it would also ensure that every single one of the HOA's knuckle-draggers would feel the weight of their incompetence in their pockets. It didn't take long for the rumors to start flying. Some neighbors, those who already hated the HOA, started whispering, laughing at the situation. Others were worried, because they knew it meant more charges for them. But the best thing, the woman in charge was holding herself together, so she wouldn't have a nervous breakdown right there in the middle of the street. At the end of the day, while the sun was setting, and the HOA members were still trying to find some miraculous solution to clean up the disaster, I went to my chicken coop, now free of sewage, sat in the paddock, and watched my chickens quietly pecking at the dry earth. The world was in balance again. There was only one last thing left to do: make sure they never recovered from this blow. But that, my friend, would be the grand finale. If there's one thing I've learned in this life, it's that the real destruction doesn't happen at the time of the explosion, but afterwards, when people begin to realize the size of the hole they've gotten themselves into. And at that moment, the HOA was up to its neck in it, but the worst was yet to come. After the concrete disaster, their office became a monument to failure, a solid block of stone and despair, a physical testament to their arrogance and incompetence. But the best part? They were still trying to figure out how to pay for the mess. Things began to heat up when residents started receiving letters informing them of a fee increase. Yes, because the only way the HOA could afford to remove the concrete was to throw the bill at the poor suckers who lived under their rules. The logic was simple. If each resident paid an extra fee, they would be able to hire a company to clear a path back to the office and recover what they could. But, you see, most people were already fed up with the HOA. Neighbors who had previously only grumbled about the stupid rules and senseless fines now had a real reason to revolt. The idea of paying extra to fix a mistake that nobody asked for was the last straw. Well, I made a point of spreading the outrage. With a beautiful smile on my face, I went door to door, talking to the neighbors, adding fuel to the fire with phrases like, "Did you see that now the HOA wants you to pay for their incompetence? Funny how they always have money to inspect curtains and fences, but now they need our pockets, huh? I bet the HOA leaders won't pay for anything out of their own pockets. How about you? Are you ready to pay for their luxury?" It didn't take long for a legitimate revolt to take shape. The neighborhood's social networks became a field of war. Outraged comments poured in by the minute. WhatsApp groups were created exclusively to plan actions against the fee increase, and even a petition began circulating demanding the complete dissolution of the HOA. The best thing was that some residents started digging up information about the association's finances. And, my friend, what they found was pure gold. Remember that insufferable woman who ran everything? The one who seemed to have a degree in community tyranny? Well, they discovered that she was embezzling money from the HOA to cover personal expenses, trips, expensive restaurants, luxury furniture purchases, all being paid for with residents' dues money. And guess what? That was a crime. The moment this bombshell dropped, the residents were torn between shock and sheer elation. They finally had something concrete, no pun intended, to overthrow the woman and end the HOA's dictatorship. The first step was a general meeting. But unlike the previous meetings, where the HOA leaders spoke and the others just listened, this time it was a public lynching. The woman tried to argue, tried to defend herself, even tried to cry, but no one wanted to listen. She was thrown out of the HOA right there, to booing and cursing. But it didn't stop there. Someone, I won't say who, but let's just say I knew some influential people on Facebook in the neighborhood, sent all the evidence of embezzlement to the authorities. And within days, the former HOA president was indicted for fraud and embezzlement, which means not only did she lose her job, but she also had to pay a hefty settlement to the residents. And the best part? With the association imploding, the residents decided to dissolve the HOA altogether. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, no more stupid rules, no more ridiculous fines, no more garden inspectors measuring the size of your plants. That bureaucratic plague that had made my life hell had finally been eradicated. Well, my chicken coop was clean and dry again. My animals were happy, scratching around in the dirt, no longer at risk of sinking into human waste. The world was back in balance. But the icing on the cake came a few weeks later. One fine day, while I was having my coffee on the balcony, I saw a moving truck stopped in front of the former HOA president's house. The woman was leaving, kicked out of her own neighborhood. It was a wonderful spectacle. She passed my lot, gave me a glare, and I just raised my coffee cup and gave a friendly wave. No HOA, no her, no more problems. My farm, my house, my peace were finally intact. And I was satisfied. And if you were also satisfied with this ending, don't forget to leave your comment below, and also don't forget to leave your like.